and protected and calm in these really confusing and perilous times that we are currently living in as a human race. I want to talk a little bit about how race, right, this sort of like sociological, psychological concept and the consequences of it and the expression of it, right, in real time discrimination appears as though, when communities align with these concepts, that the community is so safe, the neighborhood is so safe, right? Everybody's getting along. You don't really have much people out. Everybody's kind of, going along to get along, right? How race and discrimination carries the illusion when people agree to these very harmful ideologies on the surface. Race and discrimination can make communities look so safe, right? Man, these suburbs and these neighborhoods are so quiet. Everything is, nobody's really out. Nobody's really causing chaos, right? Everything is safe, right? How race and discrimination can make communities appear safe and, you know, look as if it's a community of belonging and everything is all right, right? I was looking at Nick Fuentes' interview. I want to say Pierce Morgan. I don't really watch a lot of TV. I need to. And salute to the Star Report. He posted up an interview between Nick Fuentes and Pierce Morgan, where Pierce was trying to get some understanding around Nick Fuentes' comments of that his father had made about, we don't go to Applebee's. There's black. I mean, race has to be discussed when you have, talking heads who have millions and millions of followers. All right, you don't know who agrees or who identifies a lot of times with these racist ideologies because they're not going to tell you right away. They're not going to express these opinions right away. So human beings are very crafty. They're very manipulative. They're very cunning, where they can endorse some of the most harmful belief systems and still stand next to you in line. Like everything is just like like water under the bridge. All right. So we need to study the environment. We need to have an understanding of the situation that we are in as African Americans. You do not need to be ignorant right now or blind to what's going on. It can be harmful to your safety, to your children's safety. So I'm looking at this Nick Fuentes and Pierce Morgan interview, and Pierce was trying to get some information and understanding around some comments he made on his platform about, his father not wanting to go to Applebee's because, there's black folks there, and, we don't eat in Applebee's. And, really, Nick Fuentes showed a great example of just, generational prejudice and discrimination, because he inherited a lot of these beliefs. And as Pierce was trying to, get some understanding, Nick Fuentes was kind of rebuttaling Pierce, like, you can't say these things about my father. You're trying to assume. And this is the danger when dealing with white people, right? When you mix this class of just like, they have some very intellectual, knowledge and intellectual approaches to certain things that I respect in some sense. Everything isn't about race and hating white folks. They come to the community with a lot of strengths, but sometimes you can use your intellectualism and your intellect and your knowledge for dark, right? For wrong. And he was trying to like twist around Pierce's words of like, oh, you can't portray my father as a racist. He has a job, and you can't make my father look like a race. But all Pierce was doing was just echoing the sentiments that Nick Fuentes put on his platform. And this is what a lot of the dark-sided, I would say, human beings who identify with the extreme identity of being white, this is what they do. They put real unhealthy information out there. Like, what about black people who are traumatized from racism? And you go on your platform and you're telling people, right, children, younger people, because you don't know who's watching you. Yeah, my dad said we don't eat at Applebee's because of those black folks. And, black people are criminal. Yeah, they're a small percentage, but look at all the, what message does that send? And then when someone tries to hold you accountable for what you say, or just really get an understanding, you get so defensive, right? Oh, no, you're trying to make my dad. This is some of the dangers of dealing with white people and trying to have a discussion about some of their ideologies. And it's not all white people, but people who identify with that extreme white, right? You got like regular white, where you can kind of talk to them. You can have these conversations. They're like, yeah, I see your point. And you got kind of that extreme white, it's kind of like you can't really even get feedback from them on some of their ideologies because they get so defensive. They just turn the situation. They're really good warpers. They kind of flip the situation back on you, and you're like, well, damn, I'm just mentioning something you mentioned, and then it turns to it. So it's just some very psychological, tacticy stuff that's going on in America, and it just kind of made me think, like, man, like, and he's like, yeah, we don't live around black folk. I don't want to be around black people. They're criminals. I don't want my people. And you got your opinion. And, it's not like all black people are that desperate to be around white people. You got some black people who are fine with being in their communities. You got some black people who are okay with living in communities of diversity. And if you don't want to interact with them, you don't want to hang out with them, it's okay. It's not like black people are banging on the damn door to get into the white community, right? So Nick Fuentes, right, just 27 years old, just a baby, you know, and it just really shows you how you don't know what's going on, in this country, what people believe in, what people are buying into. So I want to talk a little bit about how racism and discrimination in communities, white communities who are on the extreme side of the white, you regular white folks, this ain't for you, but you ones that are kind of like on the far deep end, how you kind of gather up in these communities around each other, right? Where you guys have these agreements, okay? And these really strong, just really hurtful and harmful beliefs, because I believe human beings have soft spots. People might come off looking thuggish, and human beings might come off looking so rugged and so strong, but people got feelings, man. We have hearts, and when God judge us, you gonna see how tough, how gangster you are, right? We have feelings. People get offended, people get hurt, people got boundaries, right? And some people, communities that hold these real, just prejudiced, discriminatory, racist views, and they kind of band together, right? All their neighbors are all on the same page, right? What's understood doesn't need to be explained. On the surface, these communities look so safe, right? Everything is in order. The grass is cut. Everything is clean, right? So people who don't have the knowledge, right? Because you got a lot of foreigners coming over here, but they don't know what the hell is going on. They're just trying to escape the poverty or the conditions that they're coming from. They're just looking for opportunity, right? A lot of times they don't really know the history. They could care less about the history. Where do I fit in? Shit, So they're coming into the American society and they're looking at some of these communities like, man, these white folks got it all together, right? Everything's clean. I can go to the mailbox. I can come back. Everything's good, blah, blah, blah. Until about 4 or 5 months of your ass being in these communities, right? And you start getting into these community events and you start really getting close to people and start seeing some of their ideologies and their belief systems. And you'll see how safe things are. And it's not all communities, but I'm noticing this. Like things that look safe on the outside, a lot of times there's these really prejudiced, discriminatory views in the inside that, don't manifest and don't expose themselves right away until over time. And then you'll see like, okay, this isn't what I thought it was. So here I'm gonna talk about white culture, right? I've been talking a lot about black people and how this is going to be a part of my European series. How a lot of times, Europeans, Britons, and whoever, Germans, there's such a diverse array of European culture. I think white was just, again, going back to the origins in its history. I talked about this in my European history. It was created to form a hierarchy based on privilege, access to land, access to resource. If you're not white, your ass is not getting in. You're not getting any land. That was the origins of white, right? This thing wasn't created at creation, right? This was a human construct socially to divide property. You can get some, you can't. Shit. All right. So this is the white that I'm talking about, right? This is not based on science. There's no research that shows where your white ends and where your white begins, right? So white culture as defined here is not a biological identity, all right, or a scientific category. It is a historical construct engineered by white supremacist ideology, originally designed as a divisive mechanism to allocate privilege to those who align themselves with a fabricated hierarchy. This hierarchy was never rooted in genetic research, anthropology, or objective science. It was anchored in social, political, and economic strategies meant to preserve power for a select group. All right. Over time, this invented identity solidified into norms, expectations, and unspoken rules that many absorbed unconsciously, turning a system of advantage into what appeared to be common sense or a normal life. The tragedy is how effectively these constructs have operated as psychological realities despite being scientifically baseless. This form of white culture functions not merely as ethnicity, but as a behavioral system, one that rewards conformity to its norms and penalizes deviation from them, because its power is not derived from science, but from collective agreement and enforcement. It must rely on intimidation, exclusion, and policing to sustain itself. Thus, communities shaped by this ideology often appear safe or orderly, not because they are morally superior, but because they regulate belonging through shared fears, selective comfort, gatekeeping, and a high intolerance for difference. The harmony is produced by homogeneity, homo, homogeneity, not by spiritual maturity or communal wholeness. I might be butchering that word. For African Americans and other minorities entering these environments, it can feel like stepping into a landscape governed by invisible contracts. One is tolerated, but never fully embraced, permitted, but never fully included. Over policing, excessive 911 calls, heightened suspicion, and disproportionate reactions become coded signals, meaning your presence disrupts what we have agreed the space should represent. I'm going to say it again. Your presence disrupts what we have agreed this space should represent. These signals are not accidental. They emerge from centuries of conditioning where proximity to whiteness was believed to equal safety, purity, order, and virtue, while proximity to blackness was cast as a threat, chaos, or inferiority. What makes this system spiritually coercive is how deeply it contradicts the teachings of God. Scripture dismantles the illusion that human created hierarchies hold any eternal value. Yet this version of white culture thrives on the very things God has denounced: partiality, pride, exclusion, fear, and false identity. It sustains itself through illusions masquerading as truth. Illusions that continue to affect where people live, how they are treated, how they raise their children, and how they navigate social spaces. What follows are 15 points revealing how this construct, right? It's like a machine, how it operates and how it creates the illusions of safety, and why it ultimately collapses under the weight of its own spiritual and moral contradictions. Okay. Number one, the illusion of safety is built on sameness. Communities shaped by supremacist definitions of whiteness often equate similarity with safety because the identity itself is based on an arbitrary and historically fabricated notion of superiority. The presence of difference feels threatening, not for logical or scientific reasons, but because the system teaches that sameness is a protective shield. African Americans entering these spaces quickly notice how their every action becomes magnified, interpreted through suspicion rather than neutrality. Thus, this peace in these communities is not a product of virtue, but a product of sameness based comfort, right? Romans 2:11, God shows no partiality, right? A lot of you extreme folks, that's kind of you're riding this extremist ideology of this white supremacy, white dominance out. You're gonna write this out to the last days, huh? God got a surprise for you guys, and it's all in scripture. It's all in the scripture, right? And a lot of times, black folks, your haters, right? Your opposers, your enemies, are folks who are spirits that tend to over identify, again, like I talked about, with the conditions of your environment. They have completely divorced themselves from any internal virtue, love, kindness, peace, right? Being your brother's keeper. They're removed from that, right? And all you have left is your circumstances, your conditions. And they take these conditions and circumstances to an extreme, right? If I can think of a term to describe them, and it's not just white people, you got black folks like this, right? Hispanics like this, Asians. It's like a conditionism, right? We have all these isms, right, that are like man made, sort of, it's like a religion. Conditions have become the racist enemy's religion, right? I am so anchored in having more privileges, more advantages, more opportunities, controlling the machine. I would die behind this, right? Conditionism, right? Over policing as a social boundary. Frequent police calls, exaggerated reports, and heightened surveillance are not random. Y'all guys ever notice, like, when black folks go to the candy store, right? People are hopping over the counter. These white folks, these Arabs, I mean, you name it, to make sure you ain't stealing. What you doing? Right? And you got these school shooters, right? The president, his life is on the line. He can't even do a speech. You got people climbing up on the building with rifles, assault rifles, right? Charlie Coach, the brother, just trying to debate, and have a conversation. I'm not a fan of him, but he's a human being. He got a right to live. Shit, right? People climbing up on the roof. Who's policing these people? Right? Who are policing these school shooters? Right? Where are the white people, the Arabs that over police these black folks when you got schools and children losing their lives? Right? You got politicians afraid to even go outside and have just debates. Right? Who are policing these buildings? Right? Well, it's just it is costing you guys. It's costing you white folks. It's costing you. Your policing is costing you, right? Because you're not policing what needs to be policed. Okay. Frequent police calls, exaggerated reports, and heightened surveillance are not random. They serve as gatekeeping mechanisms. These practices send symbolic messages. We will decide who belongs here. Because whiteness is not defined scientifically, its boundaries must be enforced socially. What isn't grounded in science becomes exaggerated and enforced socially. All right, remember that. And the police become an extension of this enforcement. What appears as vigilance is often anxiety rooted in the fear that their community's constructed identity might be disrupted. Right? Isaiah 10:1. Woe to those who enact unjust decrees. Selective comfort as community filter. In these environments, white comfort becomes a silent law. Any behavior, expression, or presence that disrupts this comfort is treated as a deviant. Minorities learn quickly that acceptance is conditional. You may remain as long as you do not disturb the psychological ecosystem built around white-centered norms. This conditional acceptance masquerades as politeness, right? But it is rooted in exclusion. Okay. Exodus 23:9. Do not oppress the foreigner. All right. You yourselves were foreigners. Ostracism describes as community standards when individuals do not assimilate, whether in speech, culture, expression, or belief, they face subtle forms of ostracism. Social distance, exclusion from parent networks, whispers, and quiet removal from opportunities. These actions are often justified as maintaining community standards through the standards themselves, though the standards themselves reinforce sameness and hierarchy. The structure rewards conformity over character, right? And you see this too, where, a lot of these black folks, not all, but, who believe just being in these suburbs and in these other communities is so much better. Being in proximity to whiteness is so much better than being around you Negroes, right? Until you have children, okay? Until you have children in some of these spaces where, and not all white communities, you got some dope white folks out here, right? Even though the whole thing is all not based on any evidence, right? White, black, all this shit that you guys throw around, right? That we throw around. But I have to speak at your level, right? Till you have children, all right? And that's where a lot of you African Americans you go wrong is you think about yourself. You're so focused on your comfort. You're so focused on what you perceive as, to be safe. And then when you have children that go to these schools, right? And the rules for the children are different for the rules than the adults, right? These children can get away with so much shit. And what would the parents say? Oh, they're just kids, right? And don't think these children don't know that. All right. That's why a lot of them are bad as hell. Not all, but a lot of them. And you know, and your children are traumatized, right, by some of the things that's going on in these elementary schools and these middle schools, these high schools, right? It's like almost like the children have to teach you your common sense, all right? The youngest have to educate the eldest, right? Because you're not thinking, and what's out there, right? But you think you know better, right? You think you're going to beat the system. You're going to be Neo, right? You're going to go into the matrix and you're going to be the one, right? A lot of times what you black folks be thinking. 1 Samuel 16:7, man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Politeness used as a tool of avoidance. In supremacist shaped white culture, politeness is often weaponized. Instead of addressing bias or acknowledging wrongdoing, people rely on niceness to maintain emotional distance from accountability. This allows exclusion to continue under the guise of civility, keeping minorities at arm's length while protecting the illusion of moral innocence. Romans 12:9. Let love be without hypocrisy. Children are granted social immunity, right? Back to my point. In these environments, white children are often forgiven for behavior that minority children would be punished for. Their inexperience becomes an automatic shield, while minority children are prematurely adultified and scrutinized. This creates environments where minority families feel vulnerable, unsafe, and unsupported, not because their children misbehave, but because the rules are unevenly applied. And this isn't saying like black children are innocent, right? We be innocent some shit too, all right? But this is just showing, maybe your black child isn't doing the wrong thing, right? Maybe your black child just wants to go to school and fit in, but they're getting all this sort of like, pushback, right? And the parents are like, I don't understand. Why is he not, and then what black parents do when their children are not getting assimilated into some of these all white schools, all Hispanic schools, what they'll do is they'll put it on a black child. Oh, it's because you're not trying hard enough, right? It's because you got all these fears, you have all these things in your head, keep going, and they'll keep pushing that child into the school. And that's where you'll see things like suicide, right? Depression, anxiety in your children, because my people, are destroyed therefore by their lack of knowledge, right? A lot of you black parents are not applying the knowledge that you're seeing. You see what the fuck is going on, right? But then you put your children in these environments and you let your children suffer, you let their mental health deteriorate, and then you put it on them, right? At the expense, of your comfort, right? And your ignorance, really. And it's not all black folks, but you know who I'm talking to. All right. So Ephesians 6:4, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger. Cultural expressions become a liability. Black cultural expression, your hair, your voice, your clothing, music, emotion becomes something that must be minimized to avoid conflict. Expression is misread as aggression, right? This is where you got the schools where they're cutting off your dreads, right? They got to pass laws for you niggas just to grow your hair out, right? Someone tell me what the fuck I'm talking about isn't true, all right? I know the hell I'm talking about, all right? Expression is misread as aggression, confidence as intimidation, and presence as intrusiveness. The pressure to shrink oneself to fit into the dominant norm creates chronic stress that white communities often never see or acknowledge. That's why a lot of times white people get so uncomfortable, the extremist white folks, they get so uncomfortable because they're so anchored in that condition, in those circumstances, in that environment, right? When you're divorced from that internal virtue, kindness, love, peace, right? That spiritual inner compass, right? Any little sort of like deviant or deviance from that, conditional comfort, it just sets you off, right? That's why you could be the black guy just working out in the gym minding your damn business, right? And these white folks are so angry, right? Those extremist white folks are so angry. They're so uncomfortable, right? Because their whole identity, their whole sense of self is rooted in their five senses, right? That's why it says to be carnal minded is death. And a lot of times there's clashing, right? There's wars. Maybe some African Americans are just fed up. They're tired of dealing with the shit, right? And then you have all these different violence that's going on, right? Carnal mindedness is death. Overextending your identity into the environment, anchoring yourself in the environment alone is death, right? In your five senses, all right? So 2 Corinthians 3:17, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom, right? Neighborhood watch groups, doorbell cameras, and community apps often reinforce racial suspicion. Under supremacist norms, surveillance becomes a virtue, not because crime is present, but because difference is present. People who never interacted with minorities before rely on stereotypes to interpret harmless behavior as a threat, making suspicion feel like responsibility, right? John 7:24, do not judge by appearances. I mean, Nick Fuentes is all of 27 years old. He hasn't even had 30 years of experience on life. You mean to tell me at 27 years old, Nick Fuentes has met every black person, right? He's met every black person, every African American, for him to make comments like, black people are not safe. I don't want my people. And this is the danger with elders leading with these really harmful belief systems on our children. Right? They're going to take that stuff that there's, he talked about his father and his beliefs, right? Well, we had some, and what a lot of times these extremist rights, what they'll say is like, well, my black father, he had some, he had a gun range, and there was some black folks in there, Randy. You know, we love the black. We saw some good black folks. We was look over there. They was praying. Just because you see black people and you honor, some of their virtue, or just because you have companies or businesses and you might have allowed them into your company, that doesn't make any impact on your belief system. You guys ain't doing any cognitive restructuring just because you got niggas shooting guns at your gun shop. It's like their whole. It's a really big distorted view of, yeah, I'm racist. And he even said it like, yeah, I'm racist. I'm fine with that. Right. But then he's also trying to say, well, we had some niggas, black folks came into my dad's gun shop. Right. That makes us not racist. Right. You know, it's a really distorted illness. Right. And he has millions of people. I'm even listening to black folks on the Star Report, just glazing this man. And what you guys choose to do is your business. That's between you and God. I sleep great at night, so I'm not losing no sleep. But we have to study this as black people. We have to study what's going on. We have to be educated, right? We'd be perished because of our lack of knowledge. We have to soak all this knowledge up, all right? So John 7:24, do not judge by appearances, right? Moral superiority is built into the identity. Because whiteness was never rooted in biology, it must justify itself morally. Historically, this led to narratives of being more orderly, more civilized, or more responsible. These myths persist today when communities implicitly assume their norms represent universal goodness. Such assumption makes it harder for minorities to be seen without prejudice. Right? Proverbs 16:18, pride goes before destruction. Exclusion becomes a family value. Children raised in supremacist influenced white culture are often taught not explicitly, but through observation, that proximity to whiteness equals safety. They learn who is acceptable, who is suspect, and who is other. These social lessons are passed quietly from generation to generation, ensuring the survival of exclusion without ever naming it as such. Proverbs 22:6, train up a child in the way he should go. Social penalties for non-conforming white individuals. Ironically, even white people who reject supremacist norms experience penalties. Ostracism, judgment, accusations of being disloyal or being labeled too sympathetic, right? I think on a YouTube video, it was this white dude holding a sign up saying, Black Lives Matter, right? And he was in this really like dominant white supremacist kind of community, and they were just slandering this white guy. All he had was a sign was Black Lives Matter. He wasn't out there saying black people were better than white people or, anything disrespectful, and they were just, you need to love your race. You fucking stupid, I mean, just like, I'm pretty sure he was fearing for his life. That's how sick this thing is, right? And what Americans do, right, was understood, doesn't need to be explained. They organize themselves around it, right? Human beings are creatures of comfort, creatures of habit. So they don't want to rock the boat, right, Randy? We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to deal with it. We just kind of organize around it, right? Our people are destroyed for their lack of knowledge. I'm telling you, this reveals that the system is not about race alone. It is about ideological loyalty, which is why whiteness is best understood as a cultural invention, not a racial reality. Proverbs 29:25, fear of man lays a snare. A few more. Diversity is embraced as decoration, not transformation. Many white communities shaped by supremacist ideas claim to value diversity while resisting any change that diversity brings. Minorities are invited as symbols, not as participants with equal voice or influence. This creates environments where exclusion is performative rather than transformative, right? If Nick Fuentes and his family is seeing the black family across the way where there's a little bit of order, they're praying together, why not connect with them? Hey, we see you guys praying and having a great time and loving each other. Hey, how about you guys come over and invite us over for dinner, right? So they see that there are black families that are doing the right thing, but they don't want to include you in, right? So Nick Fuentes is really speaking of African Americans and his experiences growing up as symbols, right? Not forms of transformation, all right? So this creates environments where inclusion is performative rather than transformative. All right. James 1:22. Do not merely listen to the word, do what it says, right? A couple more. Discomfort with accountability becomes a collective norm. Because the system protects itself through illusions, acknowledging racism feels like moral collapse. Thus, accountability is framed as an attack rather than growth. Minority experiences are minimized or dismissed because accepting them would require dismantling the unspoken rules that sustain the community's identity. Ephesians 4:15, speaking the truth in love. Minorities are expected to assimilate without burdening the majority. African Americans are often pressured to navigate these spaces with hyper awareness, adjusting their tone of voice, monitoring their physical appearances, avoiding conflict, suppressing any discomfort. Yet the white majority expects to exist freely without modification. This unequal burden reveals who the rules are designed to protect. Galatians 6:2, carry each other's burdens. And last, spiritual blindness masks itself as neutrality. Perhaps the most dangerous aspect of this system is its spiritual consequences. It convinces people that their norms are simply normal, their comfort is reasonable, and their exclusion is accidental. But scripture warns repeatedly against systems that favor the powerful, uplift the privileged, and burden the marginalized. What feels like peace is often merely the absence of challenge, not the presence of righteousness. Isaiah 5:20. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil. I pray that this message reaches those who it is meant to reach. All right. You have some good human beings out there, right, who are not identifying with this extremist sort of, distorted identity, of whiteness, who really embrace diversity, embrace humanity, and who do the word, right, of God. This is for that really extreme sort of distorted lens, okay, that is operating off of social and moral myths that are not rooted in science, all right, or any real research, all right. This is just, conditioning on really unhealthy belief systems that create these communities that appear to be safe, right, that appear to be orderly until there's a challenge, right, until there's difference, right, until you stand up against it. And after time, right, and your children grow up in these environments, you'll see that it wasn't as it appeared. Hope you guys have a blessed day.